example of step 11. What's up with all these stories that end with so-and-so could not be reached for comment? The chief of police didn't respond to 2 emails. The congressman's wife could not be reached immediately by cell phone. That's half the story. This is terrible journalism, and it's okay, that's step 11. Step 12 is writing a blog. And that's what I do. Chuck asked me to talk a little bit about how blogs fill in the gaps in news coverage, particularly where I live in western North Dakota. The news coverage isn't always what we'd like it to be, and so I try to, well, I got a phone call from a friend of mine one day, and she said, Jim, there's a big story going on over in Mandan, you want to investigate? And I said, no, Christine, I'm a blogger, I don't investigate, I speculate. That's what bloggers do, and that's an important part of communication. And so I do a lot of stories, but at the end, generally, I offer some speculation on how I feel about that story. And the most common phrases you'll hear on or see on my blog is that's a good idea or that's a bad idea. I tend to offer that kind of speculation. What I noticed after I started writing my blog and an oil boom came along is that there was not very good coverage of what damage the oil industry was doing to the Badlands and all of western North Dakota. And so I started writing about that. And I started writing for 2 audiences. One audience was the governor. I wanted him and his regulators to know what's going on so they might do something about it. And the other audience was the news media, because they weren't getting the story, and I thought if I offered it to them, maybe they would follow up and get a story out to the tens of thousands of readers instead of my little blog, reaching only a few hundred or a few thousand. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. In 1975, the legislature created something called the Little Missouri Scenic River Commission and designated the Little Missouri River in the Badlands as a state scenic river. And the Scenic River Commission's job was to meet from time to time and do what it could to keep industrial development out of the valley of the Little Missouri River, because it was our only state scenic river. Well, the commission met until 2001, and John Hoeven was elected governor. He disbanded it. And so it didn't meet for many years. And as the oil boom progressed in western North Dakota and we started seeing more and more encroachment on the Little Missouri River Valley, I wrote a series of blogs about it's time to reinstitute the Little Missouri Scenic River Commission. The governor didn't do anything about it until Doug Burgum got elected, and he liked the Little Missouri River a little more than the others had, and so he recreated it, and last year it began meeting again, and it's looking at ways that it might protect the Little Missouri River Valley from industrial development. So that's an example of what somebody who's filling in a gap, writing a blog, can accomplish. That commission has now been reconstituted and is meeting. The other example I'll use is that sometimes bloggers get used as foils. And I'll tell you the story about, well, when Jack Dalrymple announced that he was not going to run for governor a couple of years ago, there was immediate speculation that the 2 leading candidates were going to be Wayne Stensham, the Attorney General, and Drew Wrigley, the Lieutenant Governor. And immediately I started getting emails and texts and phone calls that said, did you know Drew Wrigley's having an affair? You should write a story about that. Well, I said, I'm not convinced that that's a good story. Until one day a Republican legislator took me aside and said, Jim, here's the deal. He's not going to get endorsed for governor because of his affair. Republicans aren't going to let him do that. And I thought, well, that may be a story. The fact that whatever he's doing is impacting the future of North Dakota and who's going to be the candidate for governor. And so I did a story about the 2016 governor's campaign. And in it, I'll read you the little sentence I had. I said, Drew Wrigley has gotten himself tangled up in a messy personal situation that probably precludes his nomination for governor. So that was the news, and it was the speculation. And I said the story of Wrigley's indiscretions has spread across the state like wildfire, which it had. Well, the next morning, the Fargo Forum had a story that said, Jim Fugely reported on his blog yesterday that Drew Wrigley's having an affair. And so that's being used a little bit. The Forum and the news media wasn't willing to report that story until someone else did.
There was a lot of conversation that happened before that got.
One of my fellow journalists, Mike Jacobs, also in his column wrote something like, Drew Wrigley's campaign is getting some blowback. Now, he was a little more tactful than I was, I guess. And I read that and I thought, blowback, what's that about? What's that? And I thought, oh, blowback, that's the price you pay for it. Well, you know. And so those are a couple of examples of what blogs can do. It's not so much fake news, Chuck. It's filling in the gaps in the news and allowing the other media to then to do some reporting on what's going on. Mike?
Well, as you get older, you understand that everything was better yesterday. And that's sort of how I feel about media. I understood how it worked yesterday, and you know, I had a long and interesting and rewarding career in what is now being called traditional media. There was a time in my life when I was not regarded as traditional. So, you know, there's a bit of regret that comes with a panel like this. I do think that, as has been said, this is a revolutionary time. I'm not so sure it's unprecedented. I think that the invention of the printing press is rather like the invention of the cell phone. The printing press made it possible for news to be widely distributed. Now, there were lots of issues with it, but the printing press brought us the Protestant Reformation. It brought us the Shakespearean era in England. It brought the change in the democratization of English civil law, and you know, it was a very important incident in the development of human culture. And it strikes me, and I think this is true, that we are at that kind of a moment. I liked Mark's notion that we are getting back to telling each other stories. It is the idea that the media was an independent third force, or fourth force, or whatever. What estate are we? In any case, you know, an independent force is a very modern idea. Thomas Jefferson liked some newspapers and didn't like others because some of them were for him and some of them were against him, and you knew automatically when you picked it up which side they were on. That model of journalism, newspaper journalism, prevailed in the United States well past the Civil War. It was very easy during the Civil War period to know who was on which side. So what happened in the early years of the 20th century was that newspapers predominantly, and later television and radio first and then television, became part of this media that was regarded as an important force in a democratic society, an independent force in this, and that was the happy circumstance in which I was able to spend a career. I think that two things have happened. One is the enormous democratization of media. You know, when the offset printing press, I always joked, you know, I could become a newspaper publisher relatively cheaply in 1975 as compared to somebody who wanted to do it in 1945. So I started a little newspaper called The Onlooker. I'm still using that name, which I will return to in about 35 seconds. And now we've gotten to the point where the distribution of information is no longer, it's completely ubiquitous, or nearly. My role, and the reason for the name The Onlooker, is that I see myself as a contextualizer. I'm an old guy. I no longer have the kind of energy that's necessary to go out and report stuff. When I was a young reporter in Dickinson, I visited every county seat, 10 of them, 5 one day, 5 the next. And I went to every one of those courthouses and I recorded every single coal lease. And I made a big map and colored them all in with different colors. And a guy named Bob Murray, who ran something called North American Coal Company, called me and offered me a lot of money for my map. So, yeah, but that was work for a young man or a young person. And that's not the sort of thing I'm in a position to do today. So what I generally do is watch. And I pick out what I think, of what I see, what I think illustrates what's happening. I'm sometimes right, I'm sometimes wrong. I regret every single column. Every column I've ever written could have been better. I had a great line that I made up in my mind to describe the attitude of the current administration at UND, which was, well, it isn't important. But when it's,
Yes, it is.
okay, it was, the line was, ignorant of our traditions and indifferent to our aspirations. And as it was published, it was indifferent to our traditions and indifferent to our aspirations. Well, those are two different things. Ignorance and indifference are two different things. So I regret that, and that was my mistake, and I read the column again, and blah-de-blah-de. You never edit yourself. It's the most important lesson that you'll learn. Never edit yourself, because almost everybody else is a better editor. I've got one other point to make, maybe two. One is that what's different about the current media climate is the bullying. And it's in 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, the idea was that the media was a respected, separate force in American democracy. Now, everybody's a bully, we have learned. And in fact, new media makes it possible for everybody to be a bully. I have a lot of trepidation about what might happen at a Trump rally when he starts shouting about the fake news, about fake press, and pointing them out. Now, this is not the first time this is done. This was a favorite trick of Bill Langer, too. Bill Langer, storied, colorful, populist senator from North Dakota, traveled around the state with a man named Alden McLaughlin, who was the political reporter for the Forum. And Langer would get up in front of an audience in Wishick or Strasburg or Stanley or wherever, and he would rant about the media and how they were against him. And he said, "And they're even following me around. Stand up, McLaughlin." Yeah, well, McLaughlin had arrived in the back seat with Bill Langer. So the other thing I want to say is that there is a persistent attack on journalism going on in legislators all over the country, North Dakota not excepted. If you look at the kinds of legislation that was introduced, for example, in the 2017 session, you will find a fairly large collection of bills aimed at newspapers specifically. One of them is the bill sponsored by State Senator Lonnie Lafine of District 43, a candidate for re-election, which removed the provision of law that required access. It didn't require publication. It required access to the names of people who had applied for public jobs. So now we only get the names of the 3 finalists for all public jobs. That's one example. There are many others. The interim legislative committee is now studying the laws that require publications of agendas and minutes of public bodies. Virtually every school district, virtually every city government publishes this information, usually as a result of voters mandating it. Those provisions would be stripped from the law under this legislation that's being studied. Those are only examples. There are also very many efforts to go through the North Dakota Century Code and remove all the publication requirements. So, for example, there's a serious suggestion that the sample ballots shouldn't be published in county newspapers and so on. So, from a legislative point of view, the media in North Dakota has never been under attack like this since this 1919 session, when the Nonpartisan League passed the Official Newspaper Act, which resulted in the closing of somewhere around 150 weekly newspapers in North Dakota, because they no longer had access to public printing. Public printing was centralized in a single newspaper in a county. So I think it's a very exciting time. I think that in general, the news media in North Dakota works very hard and does very well. Obviously, it's open to criticism, and I regret an awful lot of what I've done, but I'm still proud of it.